We should be live streaming now, and I will, we're just approaching the time, so I'll start with the webinar, but we'll give folks a few minutes just to get, or a minute and 2 minutes to get into the room. Just letting people into the room. We're still about a minute before start time, so we'll be starting just in a minute or so. People are just still coming into the room, so we'll just give another part of a minute.
Good luck, everyone.
Okay, Becca, I think we can probably begin now.
Awesome. Thank you everybody for joining us tonight for the webinar. We'll get started even as people are coming in so that we hopefully have lots of time at the end for some questions and discussion time. My name is Rebecca. I work with Just Peace Advocates and have been working on a lot of the divestment reports we've been putting out this year. So I'm grateful to be moderating this panel of amazing people. I'm joining from the Haldeman Tract, which is land that was promised to and stolen from 6 nations. And as we all know, occupation is a crime from here in Turtle Island all the way to Palestine. Tonight, we're joined by some amazing organizers who are all working to tear down the ties between Canadian institutions and Israeli institutions. And institutions more broadly that are upholding the occupation and apartheid and genocide in Israel, or by Israel, I should say. And specifically, everybody here has focused on campaigns to get in various campaigns. So we'll hear from each person a little bit about their work. Just a quick outline of tonight. So I'll do a brief introduction for each of our panelists, and then they'll each talk for several minutes about their work and their kind of campaigns that they're doing. And then we'll have some discussion time and question and answer. You can submit your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom, probably at the bottom of your Zoom. There's a Q&A button. That will help us track those questions a little bit easier than in the chat. So if you're able to use that function, that would be great. You can type those questions in anytime throughout the webinar. Awesome. I think that's everything. So I will get started with the introductions. So first we have Hadaf. Hadaf Zubi is a data analyst with years of experience in the healthcare sector and is a volunteer with Just Peace Advocates. After assisting with some of JPA's submission to the UN in November of 2024, Hadaf offered to support with further divestment work, helping to create a database and run analyses that form the basis of our reports. His experience in healthcare and within unions also provides crucial insight into these campaigns. Next, we have Benoit. Benoit Allard, him, is an organizer with Désinvestir pour Palestine, or Divest For Palestine, and a member of the Coalition du Québec URGENCE Palestine. Divest For Palestine is a collective of citizens, activists, and civil society groups that are engaged in the Palestinian struggle in Chohoge and Muniang, aka Montreal. As part of the Quebec Coalition, they have created a campaign, Sautant la casse des crimes en Palestine, focusing on the CDPQ, who manages most of Quebec public pension funds. and has over 27 billion invested in complicit companies. Donna Clark, they, is an organizer with and co-founder of Retired Teachers Divest in BC. Donna lives on the stolen and ancestral lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, colonially known as Vancouver, BC. Retired Teachers Divest demands divestment of their pension funds from weapons, oil, gas, and banks that are complicit in genocide and ecocide from Turtle Island to Palestine. Retired Teachers Divest has focused on the Teachers Pension Plan, CPP Investment Board, and the BC Investment Management Corporation, or BCI, who manages 11 public sector pensions in BC that represent over 720,000 workers and countless retirees. Next up, we have Faisal. Faisal Ibrahim, him, is an organizer with Queers for Palestine Toronto and the PSP campaign, which promotes BDS compliance among Pride organizations. Queers for Palestine Toronto launched a campaign calling on Pride TO to stop pinkwashing, including cutting ties with TD, Amazon, and other corporations participating in or benefiting from Israel's genocide in Palestine. And finally, we have Michael DeForge, him, is an organizer with No Arms in the Arts campaign, as well as Writers Against the War on Gaza and CanLit Response. No Arms in the Arts is a campaign led by the Toronto Writers Against the War on Gaza, Film Workers for Palestine, Artists Against Art Washing, and CanLit Response. The campaign rejects funding for the arts that is tied to the ongoing displacement and death of Palestinians. Scotiabank is not the campaign's only target, but has been a primary one for cultural workers leveraging their art and labor against the imperial war machine. Those are our amazing panelists. We've been in touch with people for most of the pensions that we've analyzed. And so we're hearing from some of those groups tonight, but there's many, many more groups, more people doing this amazing work across the country and even more broadly, including resolutions with their unions, meetings with decision makers, sharing information, campaign actions, and more. So as we'll hear from these organizers tonight, resources that we discuss will all be posted on the Just Peace Advocates website on the How to Start a Divestment Campaign link. That was where you registered for this webinar, perhaps. So that'll all be there, so you don't have to worry about that. And I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to pass it over to Benoit, and he will start us off for tonight.
Thank you, Becca. So, okay. I'm going to start with a very simple question, which is how we win. How to create a mobilization strategy for a divestment campaign. Okay, yeah. So, I'm Benoit Allard. I'm part of Divest for Palestine, the Divest for Palestine collective. And I'm going to talk to you today about strategy, basically how to win. But first of all, I want to talk about what's the difference between a strategy and tactics. A strategy is a set of actions organized over time in a defined order to achieve a specific goal. Why I'm talking about this is because more often than not, we tend to mix up strategy for tactics. Usually, people are going to jump, when we talk about a campaign, people are going to jump to the tactics, the petition, the protest, the press conference, the strikes, occupation, all of this. But we tend to forget that those are short-term actions with short-term goals. Today, I'm going to be more interested in the bigger picture. So here's a strategy step by step. First, you identify an issue, define objectives, know the target, plan escalation, react and adapt, and hopefully, in the end, you win. So first step, identify an issue. So a good campaign target issue must meet 4 criteria. First of all, it's good when it's widely felt among the community, because the more people concerned, more people you can mobilize. It's also useful if it's an issue that is deeply felt, where people have strong feelings about, because it's easier to bring them to action. It must also be winnable, because the more winnable it is, well, the more winnable it is, basically. So makes your job easier. And also, it should aim at reinforcing the movements to build solidarity and pave the way for the next struggle. More on that later. So I'm going to use the example of our struggle, the Caisse de dépôt et placement du Québec, which is an institutional investors which manages $473 billion in assets belonging to more than 6.5 million people in Quebec. So the problem with that is that it's investing $27 billion in 76 companies linked to the occupation and genocide in Palestine. So you have a few examples here. Maybe you know a few names around there. So I believe this issue meets quite a bit of a criteria, because it concerns nearly everyone in Quebec. It pertains to direct investments in an ongoing genocide. We know it's winnable because there are precedents, like previous divestments from the case, from tobacco, oil production, or Russia once it's invaded Ukraine. And also, we believe it's going to be reinforcing the movement in support for Palestine, because it requires a lot of collaboration between different actors, citizens, unions, NGOs, name it. So, we have an issue. What are our objectives? When we're talking about objectives, usually we're talking about two sets of objectives. You have the primary ones, which are the ones we're going to be telling everyone about. So this is the main demands of the campaign, the public ones. But also it's good to keep in mind a secondary set of objectives which are more internal, which relates to the organizing itself. What do we want as organizer beyond the current struggle? Usually those are not public. Our primary objectives for our campaign was to increase pressure on the Caisse de dépôt et placement until it is forced to cease all investments in companies complicit with the ongoing occupation and genocide in Palestine, and also to make sure that no further investments are made in companies complicit with violations of human rights anywhere in the world. As for secondary objectives, those will be mostly the same for various campaigns, but for us, it's to bring new people in, to recruit activists, to consolidate alliance, to learn new tactics, train new organizers, and learn from other groups, and also to make progress toward bigger demands. Well, we're starting with a big one, but we have ambitions. Step 3, know the target. This one is very important because in our experience, we almost rushed this one. We almost forgot to do a good mapping of the target. But when you plan a campaign, it's good to ask yourself, who is your target? May seem obvious, but sometimes it's not. Who is the person or institution that has the power to give us what we want? And what reasons do they have to resist? Once you understand that, you then figure out what are their strengths, what are their resources, and what are their weaknesses, and how can we exploit those? So for the Caisse de dépôt, strengths are pretty obvious, like it has virtually unlimited funds, recognized expertise, a lot of good PR, a lot of influence because it's a big institution in Quebec, and also big institutions tend to be very reluctant to change. So that's the main obstacle we need to overcome. But the Caisse de dépôt also has weaknesses, and there's opportunity that we could work from. So I talked about the previous divestments, but also there's a double discourse from the Caisse. Like we can ask ourselves, why did the Caisse divest from Russia when it invaded Ukraine, but it's not divesting from the Zionist state once it starts bombing people in Gaza? So that's the kind of thing we can exploit. But also the reputation of the Caisse is a big strength, but it's also a weakness because reputation can be lost. So this is also an option. Finally, there's accountability. Contrary to private sector banks, the Caisse de dépôt has to be accountable to the population of Quebec, and they deliver information on their investments. And the CEO, Charles Lemont, on the picture, has to answer questions from the members of the National Assembly in Quebec. So that's opportunities we can use. So here's a little mapping of the Caisse de dépôt. As you can see, the structure. This is what we done. And then it's useful to identify target. For example, we targeted depositors from the Caisse de dépôt, which are institutions that gives the CDPQ money through and to invest. So those depositors are potential target. More on that later if you have questions. So it also means not only knowing your target, but it's also useful to think about our own strengths as organizer, as movement. What are our resources? What are our weaknesses? And what kind of risk might we face? So we did the same evaluation for our movement. Like this, there's a few examples there. The fact that our movement, there's a lot of different actors. We can rely on the diversity of tactics. Also, the fact that international law is on our side. That's a strength we can mobilize. And also the fact that people in the pro-Palestinian movement, people in our group, in the Divest for Palestine, well, there's a lot of motivation and willingness to fight until we win. Well, I won't teach you what are the challenges of organizing, but here's a few one: coordination, maintaining your energy, finding money. But you see the idea. Once you have a good mapping of the target and your own situation, then you plan escalation. That means planning a sequence of tactics and asking for each: why use this tactic? What immediate result is expected? How does it exploit weaknesses or opportunity? How will it increase pressure on your target or strengthen your movement? And is it going further than previous actions? A trap people often fall into is to stagnate, keep doing the same tactic over and over until it works. Well, in our experience, it's good to have some variety in that. So I won't tell you everything about our own campaigning strategy, but you know what I said about escalation? Well, we didn't really do that because we started with semi-legal occupation of public space during 2 weeks, which is by all means a big, intense tactic to start a movement from. Then we thought about it and we were like, maybe we should do the other baby steps. So we wrote letters, we had official meetings, we made a petition, organizing assembly, we went to the local unions so they vote support for the campaign. We launched a webinar, a website, a letter campaign, did analysis, research, all of this. So we went a bit reverse on that, but you can plan the other way. Well, so here's a bit how it went. So right now there's quite some support for the campaign, but that brings me to the fifth step, which is react and adapt. Like, oh, no, not that. A good strategy isn't set in stone. So you're going to make a plan, and then you need to evaluate, did it have the desired effect? Why did it have that effect? What could be done differently? What new situations should be taken into account? So this is the kind of questions you must ask to adjust the plan. And if you keep doing that, well, hopefully you win. And that's it. But the thing is, when I want to use that as a conclusion, big wins are unlikely. Like if you're organizing, in my experience, if you're organizing, I've been doing that kind of work for over a decade. And in my experience, if you organize expecting a day of glorious triumph, a day where your opponents will concede defeat and the whole world will know how amazing an organizer you are, well, that's not going to happen. As I said, big wins are unlikely. But small ones happen a lot. And when you have a plan, a good strategy, it's likely you're going to get some small wins. And it's important because organizing isn't a sprint, it's a relay marathon. And those small wins is what keep people going. It's also not something you do alone. Movements are not born from a single person who's doing all the work. There's no heroes in organizing. On the contrary, it implies to decenter yourself and to remember that we're part of a much bigger movement. Even if your organizing doesn't reach the goal you set for, Well, the goal is not the most important part in doing a campaign. The most important part is the campaign. It's how you organize and how you keep doing that. We don't need a leader-centered campaign. Don't need even goal-centered campaign. What we need is movement-centered campaigns that build the capability to carry on the struggle until we're all free. Thank you all.
Thank you
Oh.
so much. Yeah, go for it.
And here's a few resources. I will send the presentation. So
Perfect. Thank you. And I will put the link to the Sultana Cast into the chat so everybody can find that website too. But again, we'll share all the links after. All right, I will pass it over to Hadaf.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Benoit was talking more about strategy. I'm going to take it down to the micro, talk a little bit about the tactics that we might use. So the first thing I want to do is just start out with maybe a screen share. Let's just get this going here. Number 2. Okay. Perfect. Can everyone see my screen? Perfect. Thanks so much. So as Benoit was mentioning, what we want to do in this movement is create capacity. I had originally spoken with Karen around some work I was doing with my wife, who's at University of Ottawa, around the University of Ottawa pension. Karen had mentioned some other divestment campaigns that JPA had been working on. And I thought, well, maybe I could help build capacity in my own way, not so much as an organizer, but sort of on the technical side of things, to try and create some more automated ways of seeking out data. So I'm not going to go into a lot of the database aspects of it or a lot of the sort of really nitty-gritty technical part of it. I just kind of want to cover the overviews of how the tactics would work for you to start a campaign of divestment for, let's say, a pension fund. It could be a bank, it could be any kind of organization, but we'll start with a pension fund, just because it's kind of what we're looking at right now. So I've chosen my pension fund, which is Healthcare of Ontario Pension Plan. I am in the healthcare field, so I am covered by this pension. And this is one of the campaigns that I've been working on as well with JPA. So the first thing you need to do is just take a look at what your target is going to be for the tactics. So is it the pension fund? Is it a bank? Is it a corporation? Is it an investment fund? What exactly is the entity that you want to create a divestment list for? The next thing to do is familiarize yourself a little bit. So take a look at what the structure of your campaign would look like. If it is a company, you'd want to focus on the board of directors. If it's a pension fund, you can basically just take a look from the About Us page at what their governance structure is. Usually, they'll be set up with a board of trustees. So here you can see that there's 475,000 members, but they're not the ones who are actually dictating to the employees of the fund, the CIO, the CEO, the investment professionals, as they call them, of the fund. The people who are dictating that work is actually the board of trustees. So this is what I clicked on. I've just pre-opened the tab over here. But take a look next at the board of trustees. Now, we're talking about a pension. The board of trustees is going to be different from a corporation. If you're looking at a bank, it might be the board of directors, but there's some sort of corporate board you want to look at. So when you know who your target audience is, it's the board, you can then go down the list and see who are the people that actually we can contact. So for example, if I am in QP, there are some QP appointees here. If I am in ONA, there are some ONA appointees. And if I am in SAYU, there's actually SAYU appointees. So the first step is figure out if it's a pension, who's on the board of trustees. If it's a corporation, who's on the board of directors. Those are going to be the people that you're going to be able to directly connect with. There are sort of large movements that you can do around protest and things like that, but these are sort of the specific individuals who more or less run the show. So if you're involved in a union and you want to make changes at your union-sponsored pension fund, getting involved more with your union, either stewardship or getting onto a local executive committee, these are really, really good ways. I know for a fact when I was doing it in PSAC a decade ago, you really do get a very, very strong understanding of how your union operates when you are more involved. So the first thing is basically figuring out where your attention is going to be. Now that we know what we're going to be looking at, we're looking at Hoop, we need to figure out, well, what divestment list do we want to go off of? Hoop has investments. We want to screen them against a list of companies that we know are in violation of our campaign. So who are we going to look to? Now, you might have a list on your own. It might be specific to a certain company or a certain organization, but you might also be going off of a list. So one of the ones that we use is, of course, the UN list, but we use the American Friends Society. Oh, sorry, the American Friends Service Committee, which is a group organized around the American Friends Society, which is the Quakers. So once you found your list, you could basically take a look at this divestment list, and you could follow off of this and see, okay, these are some of the companies that are being recommended to us. This could be a list of environmental violators. This could be a list of human rights violators, as we're looking at now. Whatever it is that you want to focus your campaign on, once you've found your list, you can basically familiarize yourself with, we know what the list of investments is. This is what we are going to negatively screen for. So these are the exclusions that we are looking for them not to have. And if they do have them, we build our campaign around that. So we've got our target, we've got our list. Now let's take a look at how we actually get the information we need to see if our divestment target is actually possessant of any of the companies on our list. One of the great things that you can use is disclosures that are put out on the American Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC website. Now, the SEC is an agency of the United States government that was formed, I think, in 1933 after the stock market panic, in order to basically make sure people weren't selling swampland in Florida. That's like literally why the SEC exists. So when you go to the SEC website, you can actually see all of the US holdings of various pension funds. So very simple, sec.gov, or if you do a web search for SEC, it'll just come up. Now, if you go to the SEC website and take a look at this search bar in here, any company that you want to look at, any pension fund that you want to look at that has US holdings should be in here. Ideally, Hoop itself would have a full list somewhere under strategy or under investments, a full list of all of their holdings. Other than CDPQ or CPP, because they're required to, because they're federal, none of the pension funds, for the most part, put that out unless you directly request it, and they might not give it to you. So if you can't get that full list of holdings from the horse's mouth, you'll need to go to the SEC to actually get what US holdings they have. It's an incomplete list, but at least we know it's better than nothing, and at least we know what they're filing with the SEC. So again, let's take a look at my pension fund here, Healthcare of Ontario, and it'll just come up. You might have to use the full name. What we're going to be looking for is something very, very specific. It is called a Form 13F. A 13F is a quarterly report of US holdings. You basically just take a look at the most current one. So this one, probably there'll be another one in 3 months. So probably in the next week or so, we'll get a more up-to-date one. But this one is current up until this March rather. So the last quarter that passed. So you just click on filing here, and it'll show you an information table. This information table is where you want to go. And voila, all of the holdings of the investment fund are here for you. Now, it's going to be kind of tough maybe to go down this whole list like this. So one of the things that I've done is I've just started selecting all and copying and pasting into a spreadsheet. Once you paste it into a spreadsheet, you can have a really, really good understanding of what's in there. You can make spreadsheets for every quarter, so you can compare spreadsheet to spreadsheet in order to make sure that investments aren't going up in some of the prescribed companies. and to basically compare composition quarter over quarter. But these spreadsheets are a really, really handy resource to have. The only thing that we've done extra is from my own work, I've been able to put this into a database, and we can just automatically compare. But even if you're just doing Control F, or if you can do a VLOOKUP on a spreadsheet, a vertical lookup where you're just comparing this list to say this list, you should be able to quickly come up with your results, especially if you're only looking at one pension fund. Now, in the last quarter, Rebecca and I did analysis for 30 plus maybe entities, or 20 plus at least. But if you're looking at the CDPQ or one group or your own workplace pension or just a Royal Bank or whatever it is, it should be pretty manageable to do this way. Now, I want to just take a second, and if there's any questions, we can come back to it. And if anyone wants any more details, feel free to ask, and we can come back to it. But I just want to take a second to talk about something that we've come across quite a bit. It's called indexing. Now, you might go to the pension fund and you might say, how come there's X amount in Lockheed, RTX? These are weapons manufacturers. What gives? They might say, well, it's not us. We're just indexing. Now, an index is basically a broad stock market index of many companies that basically you just buy in proportion. So S&P 500, if anyone's heard of that, is the 500 largest American companies, for example. Now, if someone says that they're indexing, a really good test, like Benoit mentioned, is check to see if they have any tobacco companies. If they don't, they're not indexing. If they do, then they probably are indexing, because anyone who wants to run the reputational risk of having a tobacco company is probably indexing if they're a pension fund. So basically what you can do is take a look at the proportions of the holdings in the portfolio against a list of what the index might be. So for example, the MSCI World Index, all the largest companies on Earth, I think there's like 1,300 or so. You could basically see if they only have 1% of their portfolio invested in Nvidia, but 10% invested in, let's say, Tesla, clearly there's, if they say they're indexing, they're not very faithful as indexers. So I know that's a lot of numbers and quite a bit of detail, but again, this work, once you kind of start on it, is not the once you kind of had a couple of times to go through it, it's not the most complicated work. So it is really important when you actually do get a win to maintain that pressure and sustain that pressure by checking the reports and saying, did they add back? Are the holdings as they promised, or are the holdings as they were last quarter, last year, etc. So I hope I haven't gone over time, but thank you all for listening and being here tonight.
Thank you so much, Hadaf. That was amazing. We've had some questions. We've responded to some, and we'll come back to other ones towards the end. But I will pass it over to Donna now.
Good evening and late afternoon to the people who are out here on the West Coast with me. Thank you, Benoit and Hadaf. So much valuable information. I am a retired teacher and I am benefiting from our teachers' pension plan, which is one of the 11 public sector pensions that's part of BCI, BC Investments. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity to be on here tonight and to listen and learn from you, my sibling panelists who seem to have just a wealth of information. As a teacher, living off a pension, public sector pension, I am living off the avails of genocide and climate collapse. Every time a bomb drops in Gaza, my pension investments go up. And I don't think that we as retirees or teachers should be forced to commit war crimes just to have solid investments. So the teachers' pension plan in BC is, like I say, one of 11 public sector pensions that's part of BC Investments. BC Investment Corporation is small compared to Quebec, it sounds like. We're about, together as a sector, 11 public sectors, unions, about 750,000 workers. Plus, we don't know how many retirees that are actually living off of the pensions. And I guess in about 2023, 24, $8 billion approximately of our pension is invested in war, weapons, genocide. And about 3 billion in oil and gas. So we are celebrating in a very small way 1 year of existence as Retired Teachers Divest. And so we're really happy about that we're still going strong. And I would say this first year, we've really just gone with our solid and good intuition about how to go forward with divestment. And we're now ready to do a strategic plan going forward. So we're hoping to do that within the next month. So the very first thing that we decided to do, which seemed right to us, was to do a major disruption, because one of the provincial Retirees Association for Teachers, there just didn't seem very much room for us to do anything becoming members of them, or putting really any pressure on them. They also contain administrators, not just workers. And so we decided to disrupt their annual general meeting. And when we went to do that, we went to do it with a really, as thoughtful as we could, social media strategy. We knew that because it was in a small room with, maybe 75 people, that it wasn't going to be so much effect. And so we decided to make it a social media opportunity. And we talked through at length about how to do that in a way that would be effective. And I think it was effective. If you go to our Instagram page, it's pinned to our Instagram page, the post coming out of that action. And it did go viral. It did get international attention, and it got more probably than 50,000 likes. And we were really pleased with that initial spark, that igniting spark of energy for our movement. And there's been about 8 to 10 of us that were involved in that action. And we've remained as a solid core ever since. It seems to have really gelled and united us. One of our strengths is that we have been, we work very closely with the local, provincial, and local Palestinian organizations. And we also are clear about the connection between occupation of stolen lands out here in BC and the occupation of Palestine. And so those are our strengths. Those have been our strengths. Apart from the Retired Teachers Association disruption and really big spark of energy for us and our movement out here, we also disrupted, we're a disruptive bunch out. The biannual Canadian Pension Plan meeting. And we worked successfully with Shift BC as well. And we're able to work with Chief Namox of Wet'suwet'en and to work together on that action. And we also documented that well for social media and got it out far and wide, which I think created some good energy in the movement out here. We've done other things throughout the year. We go to rallies, we go to pro-Palestinian rallies, we support the Scotiabank. We've supported the Scotiabank actions, the Indigo Books actions, and now we're really ready to do a strategic plan to figure out, okay, we've sort of felt through what seemed intuitive to us, and now we're ready to be a little more methodical about it. And one of our weaknesses has been, or one of the things that we'd like to develop is to have more collaboration with other unions. We initially thought that was a no-brainer and it was going to be really easy, but it's turned out to be a bit more of a challenge than we thought. I think if we decide that that's part of our strategy, tactic, going into the next year, I think we can make some headway. Let's see. It seems in terms of choosing, how do we put it? Choosing a focus. We'd like it just seems that we would like to build on the movements that already exist. For example, perhaps Scotiabank. We're heavily invested in Scotiabank, which is heavily invested in Elbit. And also Scotiabank is heavily invested in fossil fuels. It's perhaps the second biggest bank in Canada invested in fossil fuels. So supporting that campaign that already exists might be a good strategy for the movement, the movement in general. We have a whole bunch of ideas and still a whole bunch of energy moving forward, but as I say, we're ready. We're just at the point where we're going to, before we do much else, have take an afternoon at least to do some strategic planning. Thank you for your time, and I'm done.
Thank you so much, Donna. Really appreciate it and talking about the connections. That's so important. All right, next I will pass it over to Faisal.
Thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, so I'm with Queers for Palestine in Toronto, and we essentially exist mainly as a collective of anti-Zionist, anti-racist, and abolitionist queer folks fighting together for a queer Palestine. So the reason why I mentioned sort of our identity is because our primary target, at least during the summer, was Pride Toronto and its associated sponsors. While Pride Toronto itself isn't sort of a major boycott target, the underlying sponsors who are, and as well as the participants in the festival, are significant players in the, some of them anyway, are significant players and are complicit in the genocide in Gaza. And as queer folks, we are especially positioned to combat pinkwashing. So for folks who don't know what pinkwashing is essentially the utilization of the queer rights rhetoric by the Zionist entity and other entities as well, and their supporters to direct international attention away from the oppression of Palestinians and other groups as well. So it's using this rhetoric of queer rights to distract away from the crimes against these vulnerable folks of all stripes, And it's also used as a device to typically to dehumanize folks from the global south who are being exploited. So as we know, in the context of Palestine, famine and bombing doesn't just kills Palestinians regardless of sexual orientation, but also Israel doesn't even care about queer Palestinians. And in fact, it has a history of blackmailing them and threatening to out them to their families if they don't cooperate with them. And that threatens relationships between queer Palestinians, their families, and their societies. So for us as queer members in Toronto, of society in Toronto, for us, complicity in the genocide, anything that uses our name and our orientation, we refuse to allow that to be instrumentalized for pinkwashing purposes. So a couple of reasons why we chose this as a target, for the summer months, is that first of all, as I mentioned, it's personal for us. So we see it as our duty to speak up and to combat this pinkwashing. The second reason is connected to visibility and impact. So Pride Toronto has the largest Pride Festival in North America. So this is measured by the number of attendees. So 2023, it had 2.9 million attendees. And in 2024, it had 3.1 million attendees. So it attracts a massive amount of tourism and attention from the public and from the media as well. And because a major component of our activism is to amplify BDS and the BDS movement, focusing on where there's a lot of people made a lot of sense to us. So in developing our boycott targets, so we're not targeting Pride Toronto directly, but more so its complicity through the sponsors and the folks that it platforms in its festival. So we had to do some research and to dig into who these folks are. TD Bank is the main sponsor of Pride Toronto, and naturally that was a target for us. But we did some digging to look into its investments further, and we relied on research by Just Peace Advocates and as well as Peace Brigades International to do that. Pride Toronto takes place in June, and there are events that happen throughout the entire month. But typically the concentration of the main festival happens on the last weekend from Friday to Sunday, which coincided with June 27th to the 29th of this year. Festivals, I find, are an interesting setting because it's not typically just funders that you're going after. It's also folks who may just be participating in a float. And as we know, Pride has become so corporatized that a lot of folks use that as almost a promotion opportunity where they show up in their colorful floats, they're handing out merchandise or whatnot. And we don't want to see any of that kind of platforming taking place as well. They also have booths at street fairs in addition to that. So our first step was to identify the complicit folks, and typically you can find that on organization websites. And so we found that both through social media and as well as Pride Toronto's website. Sometimes you want to track how sponsorships are changing over time, and you can use tools such as like the Internet Archive to look at how that's changing. The second thing you want to do is to determine the basis under which you're choosing your boycott targets. So at Queers for Palestine, we developed a nationwide campaign called the Pride in Solidarity with Palestine campaign, or PSP campaign. And essentially, we follow the BDS National Committee's BDS and PACB guidelines. We ask that festivals do the same. We've also added all the financial institutions that are complicit in funding the occupation, apartheid, and genocide of Palestine. And we've also demanded that Pride Toronto or Prides in general adopt an ethical sponsorship guideline. And then within the Toronto context, we've taken these broad guidelines and we've explicitly listed what that means for Pride Toronto. So as I mentioned, the main target for us was TD Bank. But in addition to that, we had other targets such as Amazon, the previous year, was also a sponsor, so we targeted them, as well as some players such as who might not be contributing financially, but they're contributing in terms of political complicity, such as we also targeted CIJA, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, through its complicity in manufacturing consent for genocide and lobbying for it. I was in touch with folks from Just Peace Advocates who helped me determine how they determined the filings, like SEC filings regarding like companies that TD Bank was invested in. And we wanted to look at how those investments changed over time. So we ended up focusing on the TD Asset Management subsidiary of TD Bank. And we identified that since September 2023 to March 2025, TD basically tripled its investment in General Dynamics, which is the major supplier of weapons to Israel. So it increased its investment from $16.5 million to $50.6 million. So in choosing our targets, one of the conversations that we had was, do we want to go broad with our boycott targets? So do we want to list multiple entities, or do you want to keep it narrow and just maybe focus on a single big bank, a bank that already had a campaign behind it, such as Scotiabank? Ultimately, we landed on doing sort of a broad campaign in order to, for multiple reasons. So one, we saw it as sort of an educational opportunity for folks and a means to raise awareness, both for the general public. And in addition to that, we saw it as an opportunity to start a conversation with Pride Toronto's executive or their board of directors, rather. And as I mentioned, so in addition to that, I mentioned we targeted Amazon because of their complicity through Project Nimbus. We targeted CIJA. We also included in our list of demands any entities that are participating in, or rather any entities that are listed on the BDS list. And so that included previous parade participants such as Microsoft and Google. All the major banks as well, because of their investments in the genocide. Now, most of these other entities that I'm listing further down the list didn't have financial sponsorship of Pride Toronto, but as I mentioned, they're participating in these other ways. And then there were some also context-specific demands that we had. Pride Toronto basically has been stonewalling its members who moved a motion that successfully passed, asking Pride Toronto to hold a special general meeting to discuss the matter of Palestine and its investments in it. And we included that as well as a demand. Once we had our list of targets available, and we drafted up our demands, we sent an email to Pride Toronto and we alerted them about our demands. And we used Action Network to launch a letter campaign that we publicized through social media. And we also, I highly recommend folks also get involved with the Toronto Zaps for Palestine. That's their handle on Instagram. Despite the Toronto label on there, they actually also will help you regardless of where you are in Canada. I highly recommend that as a means also to mount a pressure campaign. And yeah, so to summarize, I'm focusing mainly right now in my discussion here about how to pick a boycott target. Some of the questions you may want to ask yourself are like, what are the material realities that are informing your choice of target? So what specifically are the investment? What's the nature of the complicity? The second thing is, are you adding to a campaign? So for example, are you adding to BDS or PACB? And how will you approach your target? So has your target been forthcoming? Are they open to discussion? Have they been closed? Are you going to approach them more aggressively? Are you going to work yourself up to that? So your strategy is going to be informed by that history. And finally, yeah, as I mentioned, so if they've been stonewalling you, you might want to resort to some direct actions and other methods to do that. I will leave it at that, and I'll pass it back to Rebecca, and happy to answer any questions later on.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I will pass it over to Michael.
Hi, yeah, I'm Michael. I'm part of the No Arms in the Arts campaign, and I'm also a member of Writers Against the War in Gaza and Canlit Responds, who are two groups that are part of the larger coalition that sort of represents No Arms. I'm going to talk a little bit about the origins of the campaign, which also gets into just our process of selecting a target, like when we talk about it. And just to sort of brief everybody on it, No Arms in the Arts, the coalition, is a bunch of different groups working across different culture sectors. And our three primary targets have been Scotiabank, the Israeli Foundation, and Indigo. We started with Scotiabank as a focus, and focusing specifically on different arts initiatives that Scotiabank's funded, and that's included the Hot Docs Film Festival, which Scotiabank recently pulled from, the Giller Prize, which as a result of the boycott on the Giller from the Canlit Response group, the Giller dropped Scotiabank, and that boycott is still ongoing because it includes the Israeli Foundation and Indigo Books. It's included the Scotiabank Photography Prize, Museum of Contemporary Art in Toronto, and a few others. The campaign started because a few of us had been involved in culture sector organizing for about a decade, and a few of us specifically around divestment campaigns, some of it related to, like I had personally been involved in PACB and BDS campaigns around the arts, as well as Amazon divestment campaigns. And a lot of us were kind of assessing what, early 2024, end of 2023, what the weaknesses were in the art sector, the culture industry. And we were seeing that a lot of the organizing and the campaigns that were starting were highly reactive, and they were very kind of sequestered, where there would be this flurry of activity around a single site of struggle, and usually, a justified outrage around something like very publicized, like the AGO firing Wanda Nani Bush over her advocacy of Palestine. And there would be this very reactive campaign that would start, but without much of, it wouldn't necessarily be placed in like a larger context, and there wouldn't be much of a long-term plan. And what would happen at the AGO would always feel extremely separate and sequestered off from organizing that, or agitation, or whatever it might be that was happening around, say, the Giller Prize or Artform magazine, or a union, like a freelancing union, like anything like that. So we were kind of like, what is a way we could bring some of the culture sector together, both around a single target, but also bring our different industries together around a shared theory of change, which includes how we actually see our role in our own industries, like especially in the arts, but in general, I think there's sort of this shared idea of, ridding ourselves of quote unquote complicity, which I think is like a good goal to have, but it can get kind of abstract. And, a lot of the institutions that we are working in or struggling against are ones that, like, we ultimately don't care about the soul of the institution. And I've sort of find like, especially being involved in PACB and BDS work, which is like work that our campaign supports and is a part of, we can sometimes get stuck in thinking our horizons are very narrow. And it's like, once we get this institution to, like the AGO, let's say 20 years from now, it drops all Zionist funders. The AGO is PACB compliant. We're not like, great, we love the AGO. The AGO is only as useful to us as we think it is useful as a weapon to wield against Israel and like the Israeli war machine and the military industrial complex. Like we ultimately, if the AGO reforms itself, great, but we don't really care about it on those terms. Like, it's as useful as it is in the context of divestment campaign, of PACB, of anything else. So when we were looking through, we tried to like map out big arts funders and arts funders that were donors to a bunch of different sectors. So we could actually bring film workers together with people like my background is publishing and visual arts, with people in like, yeah, fine arts campaigns, theater, music, etc. Scotiabank, in some ways, was an obvious target because they were known at the time as an arts bank. They have been engaged in art washing, which very similar to the way my colleague was speaking about pinkwashing, like arts washing is using arts funding as a way to obscure investments and whatever, in this case, genocide. And we also knew that Scotiabank was organically pulling out of arts funding. So this is the case with a lot of banks. They know that the arts has diminishing returns in terms of the good publicity they have, and they're moving into like charitable funding that is more like related to either sports, or things like small businesses, like entrepreneur, kind of vague feel-good entrepreneur initiatives. So one of the reasons we thought Scotiabank would be a target with some amount of urgency to it was because we knew that there was actually a ticking time limit on how much our sectors would actually be that tied up with Scotiabank. But it was also sort of a complicated one for other, like there are other banks we could have picked. Like we had thought about dedicating a lot of resources to RBC, to use an example, which I think is like a good bank to target and worth agitating around. But we were thinking about like, and one that also is like very invested in the arts. It's like a major name donor for the Toronto International Film Festival. They have a big donation prize, like a name prize at OCAD University. But with RBC, we sort of thought our role would be a little bit different because, RBC is worth organizing against and agitating around, but they've already proven themselves to be immune to bad publicity around this stuff specifically. In RBC's case, a year or two prior at the Toronto International Film Festival, like they already had a huge petition that like Leonardo DiCaprio and Mark Ruffalo and all these celebrities signed saying like decrying RBC's investment specifically in indigenous land theft and pipelines. And RBC doesn't care. It's sort of proven itself like this is not actually something we care about. And those are sort of the same when we were looking at family foundations, where we've and I can sort of get into some of the why we've ultimately taken on the Israeli Foundation as well. But when we were, early on looking at the Israeli Foundation or the Shulich Foundation, which are also major arts donors, we also felt like, well, there's not really enough of a narrative around them yet. Like in a lot of these cases, people don't even know that the Israelis or the Shuliches are like name donors or what they are, who they are. Everyone kind of knows Scotiabank. There's not quite a lot of sympathy for like a bank in general. And this was a case where on at least all these art stages and prizes like the Giller Prize or Hot Docs, Scotiabank was putting its logo everywhere. So a lot of our strategy was like, if they are using this as like a publicity tool, what is the way we can like weaponize all of this like publicity back against them? Basically like make all of those stages a liability, which in a lot of ways succeeded because after Hot Docs and Scotiabank had already severed their partnership, just as one example, like last year, Scotiabank was still officially a Hot Doc sponsor for just a few months ago, the 2025 festival. But at that point, Scotiabank had actually instructed Hot Docs to pull its logo like from all of the promotional material because they knew that the more their logo would be on things, the more agitation and protest there would be. And like the year prior at Hot Docs, we had both like counter programming to the festival itself, as well as like directors going on stage decrying Hot Docs or decrying Hot Docs and Scotiabank and talking about Scotiabank, like directly saying Scotiabank Elbit system, Scotiabank Elbit system. So like that was kind of the idea, is just making sure that the name Scotiabank and Elbit systems would be tied together forever, or until they actually do complete a divestment from Elbit. And then the other thing when mapping it out, and especially maybe when talking about other corporate sponsors or other banks, is that Scotiabank is uniquely invested in Elbit systems. Every big Canadian bank has money in the military industrial complex and has money in the Israeli war machines, including Elbit. But Scotiabank is invested in Elbit to something like, I think even with some of the divestments from last year, its investment is 20 times higher than the next major Canadian bank. And this sort of ties into the talk about like indexing and by Scotiabank's own admission, the person who manages its asset management fund, David Fingold. He runs 1832 Asset Management, and he has talked about how he is uniquely over-indexed in Israeli funds. So that includes it includes Elbit Systems, but that's also included, for instance, the holdings company that owns Sabra Hummus. And he has sort of proudly talked about how he believes in the settler colonial project of Israel and is like proud about over-indexing in Israeli stocks. So we also thought like this is a case where other banks when fighting this sort of narrative battle, they will default to the thing of like our investments aren't political. They're like this is just we have a little bit of everything. This is what like responsible, sound, apolitical, neutral investing looks like. But in the case of Scotiabank, it is actually the result of a Zionist ideologue who is like driving these investments. So that's kind of like why we centered on it. And I'd say that the campaign overall has had like varying degrees of success. We've succeeded in getting, what we've sort of talked about as a secondary project, which is like certainly it's become too toxic for certain arts institutions to be associated with. And that's meant that Scotiabank is no longer a funder of the Giller Prize, the Contact Photography Prize, or the Contact Photography Festival, or Hot Docs. It still remains like a sponsor of a number of other arts projects, including the Museum of Contemporary Art, the Scotiabank Photography Prize, National Arts Center in Ottawa. So it's still like something we're organizing and agitating around. But a lot of the bad publicity, both from us, but just all the nationwide effort, as I think as a lot of you know, did result in a partial divestment from Elbit Systems across last year. And even though it had started to quietly increase its stake in Elbit, at the beginning of 2024, it was the largest major shareholder, foreign investor in Elbit Systems, and that is no longer the case, even with its sort of quiet reinvestment. In terms of some of the other targets we've taken on, partially it's been related to some of the sites of struggle we've had. For the Giller Prize, for instance, we didn't want it to be a boycott that is just focused on Scotiabank when the Giller Prize is also funded by Indigo and the Israeli Foundation. And we also wanted to make sure that we could use these as weapons to hurl at these other, Zionist funders as well, but it's also meant that the strategy that we've taken on for Scotiabank and the reasoning behind it and what our goals are very different because, for instance, the Israeli Foundation, we are very aware that any agitation we do here is going to have very little material effect on the Israeli real estate group within Israel, because right now we're trying to hurt their charitable foundation, but that's not really going to affect how profitable it is for the Israeli real estate group to continue on in investing in settlements, in just continuing on this, like the way they've profited off of land theft for so many decades. But, most people in Canada, to the extent there is aware of the name Israeli is like, that's the thing that's on a lot of hospital donor, like a lot of things are named after this group. We don't really know who they are, what they are. And we thought to use the model in the US around organizing around the Sacklers, for instance, like organizing around pharmaceutical companies and the Sackler name in particular, which was sort of a long-term campaign, but in the end made it so that the Sackler name was like so toxic and so known for its ties to death, basically, like that it became too toxic for like museums to have Sackler wings. So, just to use an example of like trying to map out targets, but also have realistic goals around them. Like that's sort of what I think, long-term narrative goal we have with Israeli, and to the extent it's starting to succeed is that I think, at the beginning of 2024, 2023, they would tend to not have to comment on any of this stuff, and most people writing about the Israeli Foundation wouldn't even bring their ties to investments and settlements up. And now, like, they actually have been forced to comment on it, and those ties have been brought up as part of the boycott demands. Whether they're written about critically or supportively, like, there's at least has to reckon with this as a demand, and why, the reasoning why. So yeah, I think I might have gone on a little bit over, so I apologize. But yeah, that's where we're at with the campaign and some of our thinking behind it.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael. Thank you, everybody. It's great to learn from everybody, and obviously we can see there's lots of ways and strategies and reasons to pick different targets. I'm going to go through some of the questions we have, and you're welcome to add more questions in the question and answer tab. I don't know what it's called. At the bottom, it says Q&A. First, I'm going to ask a question for Hadaf about analysis. Two pieces. One is if you can maybe just talk a little bit more about indexing, because it's so often used as an excuse, and we get a lot of questions about it. So that's one, indexing. And then the other, we have a question that's a great consideration about tracking the value of investments versus the number of shares over time. So if
Sure.
yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, no, two great questions. So I'll start with indexing and then go to value versus amount. So first of all, for indexing, most pension funds, I'll just use pension funds as an example. So banks aren't really indexed. For the most part, they'll follow more or less whatever their capital requirements are. So as Michael very, very well put it, Scotiabank is specifically invested in Elbit through one of their funds. There's the fund manager who is, an ardent Zionist and is very public about that. But for the most part, when we're talking about indexing, it's more on the pension fund side. So basically what indexing is the fund manager saying, there's a great deal of financial academic literature that shows that on average, most fund managers shouldn't be paid what they're paid because they don't beat their index, right? They're overpaid more or less. That's why you shouldn't, in most cases, mutual funds are not a great deal. So what you're basically doing when you're indexing is you're saying, we expect the S&P 500 to go up 10% a year because it's gone up 10% a year. It's more like 8% over the last 100 years. So we're just going to basically accept that whatever we want from equities, we want an 8% return. We want to basically match the S&P 500. So what we'll do is we'll go in and we'll buy up those 500 companies in the proportions that they are on the index for. So let's take a look here. I still have the MCSI page here. I'm going to open up a spreadsheet here. I'm going to show everyone where I got it first. You're going to commonly hear some questions about, or sorry, you're going to commonly hear some comments about we are indexed to this or that index. So once you find the index, usually the most common one is the, what is everyone seeing right now? Are you seeing my web browser or my spreadsheet?
Your web browser, the iShares.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Rebecca. So basically, most folks are going to say we global index, world index, MCSI. Sometimes they'll say it, but when they say it's just the world index, like we're not even particularly indexed in North America, they're usually talking about the MCSI World ETF index. Now, this is an ETF. I only bring up the ETF because the index is just a list of companies. ETF is where a company goes out, buys those companies in proportion, and sells it to you, the investor, or your pension fund, or whoever. When you go to this website, though, they have to basically list the proportions. So all I've done is I've gone here to the data download here, and I've just downloaded all the information. You can also go to holdings and just download it from there. So what I'd like to do is show my spreadsheet, and I also kind of want to talk a little bit. I don't know if folks saw the article today in The Guardian, a rather large expose by Guardian 972 and another another outfit that name escapes me. But basically, Microsoft's calls Azure cloud computing databases hold millions of phone calls of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. I'd encourage everyone to type in Google, or don't Google, but type in web browser, Guardian Microsoft Israel article just came out today, and it's been making the rounds. So I wanted to show everyone what I'm using. Can everyone see the spreadsheet?
Yeah.
Perfect. So I use something called LibreOffice. It's just an open source alternative. We're not probably going to get our employers off of Outlook tomorrow, or, probably people are still going to be using Gmail. But if we can start to move away from Gmail, you can start to move away from Microsoft, you can take personal steps and then promote them within your organization. So I'd encourage everyone who doesn't already know about LibreOffice, check it out. Open Office, LibreOffice. As you can see, it's not quite as fancy as Excel, but it does the job and it's free. So especially if you get a new computer, don't pay Microsoft their $150 a year. Again, this is just a free alternative to it. So this is basically what it looks like. I want to take a look at the spreadsheet because we're going to cover two things. We're going to cover indexing and amount versus number of shares. When we talk about indexing, basically all of the shares in your pension fund need to look like this. There needs to be 5.71% invested in Nvidia. There needs to be 4% in Apple, etc. A really good check is this dirty little company here, Philip Morris International. Now, PMI doesn't make weapons, they make cigarettes. Cigarettes aren't dropped on children. I know there's a lot of debates around secondhand smoke, but we're talking about weapons versus tobacco. Now, tobacco is usually excluded. So if you look down this list on your pension fund and they have, for example, IBM or Goldman Sachs or any of these companies, McDonald's or Caterpillar, but they don't have Philip Morris, they are not indexing fully. Now, as I said before, if they go out and they're like, yeah, we're indexing, take a look, we even index in Philip Morris, we even own tobacco companies, they're pretty committed to indexing it, it would appear to be. So basically, if someone says we're not indexed, you take a look at this, and if any of the share values don't match what the proportion is, like let's say, they have, instead of 0.35, they have 3.5% in Cisco, that's not indexed. So you can basically just get a list like this. You can contact us. We can provide you some resources as well. But that's whether or not they're indexed. So if they make the excuse that they are indexed, there are things you can do to remove certain companies from the index. So for example, a lot of pension funds that you look at, Hoop, for example, more or less indexed, but certain things are out of whack and certain things are excluded. So again, it's a little bit of a balancing act because if you look, NVIDIA and Microsoft are on BDS lists. But there are ways that you can overexpose yourself, for example, to Apple. There are ways that you can actually expose yourself to the whole index. What we don't want to see is picking and choosing. So for example, if you're not invested in tobacco, but you are invested in arms, or Palantir is a defense company, it's not really information technology, then you can de-index to a certain degree. So I don't know if I covered everything about indexing. I'll move on to share value versus share numbers, and then we can go back if I missed anything or if there's any further questions. So on these forms and in the SEC form, you'll see the quantity and the market value. So quantity is the number of shares, and this is from August 5th. So I think this is just from yesterday. Yeah, as of yesterday. Basically, all they've done is taken the price of NVIDIA yesterday at closing, which was 178 US dollars, and multiplied it by this many shares. So 17 million, it looks like, or 1.7, yeah, 1.7 million. So that's basically the difference between quantity and value. So value is the entire quantity multiplied by the price, and quantity is just the number of shares. Now, when you're looking quarter to quarter, don't look at market value because that fluctuates and it's not up to date because it's as of the quarter end. So does everyone remember that Hoop thing we looked at on the SEC website? That Hoop filing was actually current as of the 31st of March, even though it was put out on the 14th of May. So those prices for that total market value, that price times quantity, the quantity probably hasn't changed, but the price has. So the market value is different. So When we talk about a market value of something on a filing, it's out of date. One of the things that we might want to do in the future is basically just have whatever quantity it is on a spreadsheet or on a website, and then pull in the price of the daily close of that stock. So you could basically have, as of today, this is how much their holdings in NVIDIA were worth or whatever. But that's basically it. You've got a daily price, a quantity, and the market value is just quantity times price, and that's it. Now, again, if you want to see if an investment is going up or down, if you look at quantity and it remains the same quarter over quarter, but the market value drops or goes up, that doesn't mean that they've added or divested at all. It's just a function of what the price is. So if you want to speak accurately, if you want to say that they've doubled their holdings, it means that this quantity is times two, not the value. Because the value just means that the stock price doubled, the quantity might be the same. So if we talk about divestment, for example, and here's a positive example of how this might work. If the quantity goes down, but the value goes up, it might just mean that they are divesting over time, but the stock price is going up. So I wouldn't be super focused just on value, even though value is the big headline, 30 billion, 100 billion, 40 billion, right? I think quantity is for the analysis piece, the important thing, because if you have market value that's really low on a filing, but the stock has shot up and you really want to make it seem like, oh, they're profiting off of this, you could basically say, if NVIDIA doubles, you could basically say that they've made X amount of dollars on the quarter off of arms sales or off of companies involved in climate change, whatever it is. But in terms of your actual holdings, it's the quantity that you're looking for.
Thank you. That's super helpful. And if anybody wants, this is recorded on YouTube, so you can always go back and look at that if you want. I'm gonna go to another question. And this one is about how to address the fact that a lot of these companies, well, let me just read the question. The question speaks for itself. Thoughts on the broader ways that multinational corporations are financing the occupation's entire infrastructure, and how we can make divestment calls specific enough to be able to succeed, but also honest about the realities of globalized racial capitalism and how interconnected finance is. And so while we're talking about specific divestment targets, we know these things are all connected in the same web of settler colonialism and imperialism. And so how do we balance that reality with choosing specific divestment targets? Benoit, do you want to answer that maybe?
Yes, that's a very good question because and it relates to the question how narrow and how wide a target do we aim at, which was I think Faisal talked about it a bit. That's a very good question because basically any company, any multinational company which has a stock values is complicit of some sort of war crime or violation of human rights anyway. They're all bad because capitalism is bad and because it's a settler colonial system, all of this. So how do you balance that? But the thing is, there's plenty of target, plenty of bad people, plenty of people to aim at, but there's a strategic reality that we can't shoot at everything. Well, we can try, but it's not very effective because what works is usually concentration of effort. So the real question is, what are the best targets to concentrate our efforts at? Well, some thoughts about this is, well, the questions I laid out in my presentations and other laid out in their own struggles, like if a target is already attacked by a lot of people, well, it's probably a good target. So also is how easy is it to attack and how easy it is to explain how bad it is? Because we're seeing that with our, I'm going to take the example from Divest For Palestine. There's 76 companies we're aiming at. So there are weapons companies, General Dynamics, Lockheed Martin. Those ones, very easy to explain what's the issue. But there are companies that are more indirect, like Google and in Microsoft, sometimes it's more difficult. So what you can do is you can have a broad demand, but you can then focus your action on specific targets. So you can have in the discourse a large target, but doing strategic prioritization. So you don't tell we're not you don't tell we're only interested by Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics, or only interested by weapon companies, but you can use kind of those weapons companies, focus them on the message, in the mobilization, and focus the efforts on those specific targets, which are usually easier to mobilize on and to get progress on. And then once you win about the company that is very obviously bad, then you can do the next one. So I think this is the idea. But I really liked what Michael said, which is like about institutions. Like, we don't care about the moral integrity of the institution. It is only useful as a weapon against the Zionist entity. I think companies at targets are all the same. Like, Lockheed Martin or Google are only useful as weapons against our enemy, our bigger enemy, which is settler capitalism.
Yeah. I was also going to reference what Michael had said, so that's perfect. Thank you. We'll try to answer a couple more questions, and if not, we will. I'm going to make sure we have these down in the back. Towards the end of most of our pension reports, we have a frequently asked questions section, so we can continue to add some more of this information that we're answering there. So just so you know, question for Michael. Person says, I love your art, and also a question. What are your thoughts for responding to the critique of biting the hand that feeds you? It seems challenging to target an institution that is a sponsor when arts funding is so limited. Does this only work strategically because Scotiabank and other banks are distancing from arts funding anyway? Does the movement propose an alternative?
Yeah, well, I'll say this is, this has been a part of our campaign, but it's not been a primary goal. But we have been trying to actually challenge what we see a sustainable art world like, because in our mind, whether or not Scotiabank was already pulling, we would find it unacceptable. And I've been involved in other kind of divestment campaigns around, say, like Amazon or Indigo maybe being a good example in Canada, where a lot of the times we are talking about staking our livelihoods on the supposed benevolence of a company that like ultimately doesn't care about us. And that is like, aside from, and this is a big aside, but aside from everything else, like that is not a sustainable way for any art sector to run, for any industry to run. And the fact that so many institutions have, staked their livelihoods on, say, a genocidal bank, that was never going to be long-term beneficial. And I think we also have been trying to question like exactly how some of this money gets distributed, like as well, because a lot of institutions, when defending themselves, will use the funding crisis, which is real, as a way to paper over a lot of other things. So, for instance, with Hot Docs has been plagued by scandals around mismanagement. It had a number of its programmers resign last year. It didn't file its taxes properly, but it will use agitation around Scotiabank as a way to say oh, we're now in a funding crisis because of the Scotiabank thing, and not we're in a funding crisis because we've mismanaged like stuff for so long. And that's the same with the Giller Prize right now is asking the federal government for $5 million for 3 years to keep operating in light of not having Scotiabank as a funder anymore. The Scotiabank or the Giller Prize is $100,000, which is a life-changing amount for the author who wins it, but it's also kind of the lottery, right? Like the book industry isn't like most people aren't winning a Giller Prize, right? So I think there's this other way that institutions have been trying to say all of these things are dependent on this like one way of funding, when that historically hasn't always been the case. And so a big part of our campaign has been trying to model certain alternatives, which is like usually smaller ways of running ourselves, and that's like things that are by artists and for artists. So like a big part of our campaign has included counter programming in some way that is in some ways oppositional. We counter programmed hot docs. We've done an alternative kind of like Giller book talk. We held an alternative Giller gala on the steps of last year's gala. Like we sort of took it as both a picket line and a protest, but also a thing that celebrated all of these authors standing in solidarity with Palestine on the steps of the Giller. And we know that that isn't going to be like, this isn't suddenly the alternative, but we want to actually say like there is a role to play in modeling what we actually want our industries and our communities to look like. And just to also close, like Indigo being a very damning example of Indigo Books has been like so devastating to the actual book industry. So like in addition to Schwartz and Reisman being awful people who fund awful things, Indigo Books has like gutted our industry. It has like decimated a lot of independent booksellers, and even though independent bookselling has been on the upswing in recent years, the booksellers that closed will never come back. And it has been particularly devastating to small press Canadian publishing. But now Indigo has just embedded itself in the industry, like it's taken all of us hostage in this sort of benevolent benefactor role, and Reisman trying to like model herself as like Oprah, Canada's book lover in chief. But in a lot of our lifetimes, we can remember a time when that wasn't the case, when Indigo didn't have its tendrils into all of us. And it just, I think it takes, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a lot of rethinking, but I think we can move towards other models. And we don't, as a campaign, we don't have all the answers, but it is something we're trying to have active conversations about.
That's great. Thank you, Michael. It is 8:30, so we'll wrap up, but I do want to give a chance. Faisal or Donna, is there anything you want to add? I know we didn't get to more questions, but is there anything else you want to add before we? Okay.
I can sort of add to the aspects that Michael was speaking to in terms of needing to program alternatives. So one of the things that we were trying to do as part of Pride is to also get performers to see how much pressure were they willing to put on the institution. However, like one of the things that we face is, of course, we're understanding that folks depend on gigs and performances during Pride for their livelihoods. So we've been engaging in conversations, and they're heading in interesting directions, and we're thinking through sort of counter programming. So I just want to elevate that, and also I think in terms of secondary goals of some of these campaigns can also be to build broader coalitions to figure out who's participating in these, in our case, it's a festival, and how can you also like use it just not as just a goal of divestment in and of itself, but also as a means to bring people into the movement as well, to build the coalition. Because I think ultimately it's broadening the coalition that's going to, help us win these gains and to help us turn the tide, as we're already seeing happening in society. But we need to make that happen faster.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to the panelists, as well as everybody who attended. This is already on YouTube, so you can go back and watch. Karen has put the link into the website post where we'll share resources. And there's also a form there if you're interested in getting involved in divestment campaigns. You can fill out that form, or you can always also email us at info@justpeaceadvocates.ca. Thank you so much, and we'll continue working together, and we need all of us. So thank you for joining, and that's it.